Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Neil Johnson. He's a professor of physics at George Washington University. We're going to talk about his work. Instead of me describing it, I'm going to ask him. He'll explain it better. So, Neil, thanks for coming.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for this opportunity. I am a physicist, but unlike a lot of physics, which aims to kind of break things apart and understand things down to the individual level, I look at an area of physics which actually takes up a significant amount of physics, which is what surprising things happen when you put together objects. So, for example, put together water molecules and you've got something suddenly that if you take it to a right temperature, it can freeze and you can skate on it. It can also bring down a ship, the Titanic, boil it up, and you create bubbles, and which are suddenly these kind of correlated pockets of molecules that completely change the system from a water into a gas. And it is that aspect of the system that where something collective happens, something happens to the system you would never be able to predict based on the individual objects themselves.
Huh.
So examples of that.
I was going to say, right? What kind of systems are you looking at? Yeah.
I look out the window now. You can hear some traffic in the background. That's traffic, and it's traffic at the time of as everyone's out on the street. Why is there a particular jam outside at this moment, whereas 5 minutes ago there wasn't one, and in 15 minutes there won't be? There's no reason. It's one of these like phantom jams. This is a phenomenon that's as common in everyday life. Look up at this. Hopefully everyone's got a blue sky around them. You'll see birds collecting into flocks at this time, starlings, etc. And why is it that they break up into these groups? They form these groups and they're ethereal. They're there for a while and then they merge and then they break up. Why aren't they all in just one great big group? Or why aren't they just flying around by themselves? Same with fish. And the same with people online. And that is the area of physics. If we can call that physics, I certainly call that physics. That is the area that most interests me and my research group at this moment.
So, what system are you looking at? Just living systems like flocks of birds? Are you looking at inanimate systems? What's your focus?
Yeah, so I personally came from, going back centuries to when I did my PhD. I worked on kind of the equivalent of flocks of birds or jams of cars, things called excitons, which were collections of positive and negative particles. It was always the interest. Well, why do they go around with, sometimes there was one of one and one of the other. That was common, or two of one and one of the other. Well, that was something everyone was kind of looking for at the time. And if you take that into to topics such as, I'm sure people have heard of superconductivity, those kind of correlated collections, those pockets, those almost like communities of particles, and why they hold together in a community and behave like a community as opposed to just 100 copies of the same individual object. That underlies so much fascinating and important physics. We think previously of things like superconductivity and something called the fractional quantum Hall effect, but now people are thinking about quantum computing, where you can get these kind of collections of objects to do surprising things that you wouldn't have thought. Well, I worked in that area, and then one day somebody turned up to me and said, hey, you're looking at this, you look at crowd behavior in particles, and why don't you look at crowds in markets, financial markets? And naively, I thought, oh, great idea, we'll go in and we'll nail that problem. Well, that is a really hard problem, but it typifies what I'm interested in now and actually taught me something about physics. Because let's think of, for example, people like crowds of traders in markets. They're getting information from each other. They're also getting information from the outside that they themselves create. They create the movements in the market, and then they collectively respond to the movements that they themselves create. Now, of course, there's a terrible complication there, which is that there's also external news. Stuff happens in the world. And so that also affects the market. So it's really hard to unpick that behavior. However, I was fascinated by that problem. I still am. And that problem morphed into, while we were still looking at it, an interest in, hey, well, people crowd in other aspects of real world extremism. They crowd into, why is it that people suddenly begin to, why is it that lone wolves appear? Is it that, they were just literally a lone wolf? Or was it that they were in a pack and they broke out and then a pack formed another pack? And then what you're really seeing is something being spat out after a whole set of different packs that they've been in. And so we started in 2014 really getting interested in what we were seeing online at that time, which was related to extremism around ISIS. Not very pleasant topics, but it was fascinating because there was a system, unlike the molecules and unlike the birds, unless you've got all day to look at the birds. We knew the size of the flock because you can see online the size of the communities that are created. You can see their overall activity, and you can see what other communities they're connected to. Now, just at the risk of, not wanting to sound like a kind of Cambridge Analytica, from what the claims are against Cambridge Analytica, none of that involves asking a question about the individual bird, the individual molecule, or the individual person online. It is all to do with the community, some sizes of which are 100,000 up to 1 million or more, and asking how, like the birds in the sky, why is it they move as one? Why are there two? Why are there, which we found at that stage, 200 communities that were supporting ISIS? Were they just didn't know about each other? Or was it that they were interested in different kind of flavors of that support? And so that was something that we published out in Science in 2016, and it mutated that interest into then an interest in extremism in general, and now what we're looking at, which is vaccine hesitancy.
Well, any system of anything, birds, people, whatever it is, there's an identification with the group. There's still a preservation of self. And then because there's an identification with the group, the group responds to, each individual in the group responds to its own stimuli and condition, but the whole group as well does the same. So,
correct.
I don't know. What mystifies you about this, at least in terms of living systems? I can see, okay, it would commonly happen with non-living systems. That's different. But what mystifies you about this?
Yeah, that's a great framing of that question. Well, the point is, once an object, be it a molecule, be it a person, be it somebody in a community, once you're in that, it's exactly as you said, you've got your own internal compass, as it were. You've got presumably some, that as a physicist would call it, you've got some internal kind of variable, internal spin, you might say. There's some external field, which is probably coming from that's the news. And then you've got the local interactions. Of course, online, there is no such thing as local. Everything's next to each other. But you've got the interactions with the other objects within your community. And so there's a competition. There's your natural direction. There's the direction that you're being kind of quote unquote forced into by external news. And then there's the direction that's because of your neighbors, the neighbor effect of up to 100,000 people in the same community as you, kind of promoting certain types of views. And so the competition of those three, that's the thing that interests us. And how robust is that? Does the thing just dissipate? Why is it that some grow really quickly and others don't? Why is it that some become more extreme? Why is it that some end up opposing COVID vaccines? What's going on with that? And of course, immediately it sounds, whoa, you've gone way off of physics. Yeah, okay, but it's like pursuing the problem rather than thinking, is it still physics? Well, I still class it as physics because it's to do with so-called many-body interaction systems, which is a core thing in physics. But it brings in sociology, it brings in all of us. I mean, it's a very real problem in that sense.
Well, how do you get a size of groups online and who the members are? It sounds like kind of like, I don't know, I guess gaining access to the group without their knowledge or infiltrating it. I mean, what?
No. These are. We're not looking, and so I say the word group just in a generic sense. We don't look at Facebook groups, for example. We look at the pages, just pages on Facebook, just pages. They're public. We could sit and look all day at Facebook pages and look at the size of them, look at how often they're posting, what kind of thing they're posting. All of that is public information, and it involves no information about any individual. It's just, what starts them off on conversations. What
have you, I would guess in any group you have like an 80-20 effect. There's a few very vocal people within any group that, steer and guide the conversation. And then a vast majority of them, I'm sure, are like lurkers, silent lurkers.
Correct. I mean, correct. Absolutely. Just like in a group, like a social group, when we used to have social groups in the real world. You go out with a group of 20 people. Yeah, there's some that are just kind of dominating it, some that are just kind of lurking around. You're not even sure who that. I thought it was a friend of you. No, it's a friend of not a friend of anybody. And then there's the kind of silent majority that just kind of sit there and are kind of, occasionally making comments. And that is the particular area of people that we're interested in, just because their opinions can tip the balance one way or the other. We're not interested in the individual. I'm an on the fence guy with a whole bunch of stuff because I probably haven't thought very well about it. I'm not very smart in other, thinking about things. And I just kind of go along. How many of us have been in a situation of, we're with a group and where are we going to go eat or something? And we'll go here because so-and-so from the group knows best. I just kind of go along with it. Well, there's a lot of that online. And particularly what we found, today of all day, today necessarily every day there's news about vaccines. But these months, all the time, there's things being announced. There are then people reacting within the communities. And what we found is the tipping points, the large communities that presumably, from what they seem to be, worried about the kids, worried about kids' safety and these kind of things. They're ones that have to go and get vaccines, like you and me. And yet they're a community of pet lovers, or they're a community of exercise fanatics, or they're a community of yoga lovers, or whole foods, food lovers, organic food lovers, foodies. And yet, at this particular moment, they're being exposed to material to do with vaccines. And every so often there's like, what would we do? And suddenly, because they trust each other, there's an element to which that field that I talked about earlier, it's like that almost like, the local field within the community begins to outweigh the external field due to the news and possibly their own internal compass or spin. And
I would be careful in this environment. I mean, I've personally witnessed tons of censorship. There's also plenty of groups that have, accounts on various social media that are not real, and they're orchestrated to give opinions and have personas and all that. So, I mean, in studying this stuff, it might be very difficult. I mean, or it might be a great signal, but I don't think these are very natural groups. What's going on right now? A flock of birds is not necessarily going to have all the, the dynamics that are going on with COVID and with vaccines in general.
Correct. Possibly correct. Because there was always that, particularly, I mean, when you move to the political sphere, 2016, etc., it was, it was meant to be managed, and there's certain actors, and we always tend, though, to think that there are a few people orchestrating the behaviors. And when we did, our study on precisely this problem of the vaccine hesitancy, which was published in Nature in a few months ago, what we didn't find that kind of hierarchical structure. Of course, there are some communities that are more active, that are more embedded, that are more quote unquote influential than others.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
But we saw something a little bit more, I think, more scary than, I mean, it's the easiest thing. If there were particular actors, then social media companies could go after those particular actors. They'd be kind of quote unquote guilty. I mean, it's the classic thing of, that's what everyone used to hope with extremism, right? Of the radicalization. Who did it? Who was the one? Who was, who can we, who can we convict? Depends on what your perspective is. So, if you're law enforcement. But what we're seeing is that it's actually more, particularly for this case of the vaccinations, it's more organic than that. Let me get a particular example. So there's a lot being written about QAnon, of course. Absolutely. I mean, the idea that, that there's some kind of deep state involvement, influence that kind of playing out. But deep down in that, there are a lot of people involved with that don't necessarily buy into the idea of the paedophile rings, etc., but do hang on to the message of the save the children. And that hook line, save the children, is like that's something that then drags in whole sets of other communities that I've never even thought, probably may not have even heard of Q. They've never heard, they don't believe in Pizzagate. They've been to the pizza place in DC. They know there's no basement, et cetera, et cetera. So this interaction, what is it that makes pockets of people, 100,000 people, shift one way or another? Is, of course, it's a really important question for the political sphere, but bring that into the health sphere, and that's going to have serious consequences.
Well, I mean, are you under the premise that a vaccine will be safe and effective, or there's a basic assumption there that I think some people have that it won't be, and they may not trust it.
Exactly right, and that's what we see play out then in these. We label in our paper, we label ourselves. When we go and look at these communities, we do not look at individuals, we just look at communities. But the communities, since they're groups of trusted people, it's like going out with a group of 20 people. If there was somebody who nobody could put up with, they'd kick them out. So these communities tend to be like, to some degree, similar thinking about one issue. They may be pet lovers. They may love German Shepherd dogs. They may, whatever it is. They've got something under which they kind of trust each other. And so we go through and we look at these communities, and it's exactly as you say. It's not that the people are one way or the other. Of course, they would be if you were to go and ask individuals. But so are the communities. And since the communities of size 100,000, etc., when we look at our map of, there might be like 1,000 communities that we found across, just say, Facebook, that are talking or embedded in some way in the vaccine discussion, happen to be at this moment. That's up to, it's 1,000 of these clusters. Let's say 100,000 people in each of them, which is a typical size for a community. It's 100 million people. It's 100 million people. And so understanding that network, we're not in the public health business. We're not in we just want to understand the system. We want to understand how it's connected, and therefore, why is it that when, for example, Facebook goes and shuts down what they think is the biggest flock of birds or the biggest community that is influencing everyone else, it seems to have little effect. That's because they haven't really got a network picture. And it's that network picture of communities connected to other communities. That's what we try to build and do the quote unquote network science or physics of.
What's your end goal? You say you want to understand, but what are you trying to understand?
Yeah, I think, I just have a very simple, I'm not a philosopher, I know nothing about any of that, but it seems to me that you can't win any kind of battle, any kind of misinformation battle, or any kind of, presuming you're on the quote unquote the good side, you can't win that without a map of the battlefield. How can you even go about trying to bring people over to your side that maybe the vaccines are okay, or maybe, extremism is not, right-wing extremism is not a good thing to be following, or what you pick, or maybe climate change denial is not the thing to be followed. You're trying to bring people over to your side. How can you do that if you don't understand the battlefield in which you're operating? And there's a big mistake, I think, in my opinion, based on our work, that we see in terms of, just take congressional hearings. It's typical, bring in the largest actor in the field, which is Facebook, etc. Tell them they're not doing enough, and And then Facebook reports back, oh, we've shut down 50,000 accounts, 100,000 accounts, 200. Yeah, but there's 50 billion. So,
well, how can anyone expect to understand? I mean, do you want to understand, or do you want to understand to co-opt? It sounds like
we
people want to understand and co-opt. It's not like I hear the labels that you know, climate change denier, vaccine anti-vaxxer, or vaccine hesitant. Like, it doesn't sound like there wants to be an understanding to understand. It sounds like there wants to be an understanding to control and to squash.
No, I'm very much a believer in not that. And that was my point about the typical approach is to go in and shut down account. I don't think that should be done. You know, imagine me. Imagine me in a class of physics. You know, somebody saying, "But hey, doesn't the electron go right? Get out." You know, that's wrong. As soon as you say something wrong, you're out the class.
Well, again, in the arenas that you're studying, that happens. Like, you know, I wouldn't.
It doesn't.
If I was the authorities, I wouldn't be surprised at all that, you know, they don't understand what's going on and things are not working and people are resistant because by them saying that, they're not understanding. Like, I guess it's a foregone conclusion, or the assumption is that, oh, of course, for instance, like, oh, of course vaccines are effective. What's wrong with these people? Why wouldn't they think that? But you can't assume that, you know, if you do that and then you think, oh, how do we control them or stop this dissent?
I'm totally in agreement with you. Yeah. So to get to, to lay out quote unquote an end game, as you asked me to do, our belief is that it shouldn't be. I mean, people should be allowed to have the opinions they have. So, and sometimes, for example, the discussion about the microchip being inserted, which is a problem, that was based on a scientific paper. That isn't a piece of, you know, the people that believe that, they're not wrong. They shouldn't be chased down. They're actually citing a scientific paper that was published at the end of 2019. So you have to be really careful about just kind of stamping out, kicking out. That's not the way to engage. Getting back to my point then is that it's only by having a map of and seeing these large sets of on the fence communities, they are the ones that are looking for information. They are the ones that that would benefit and probably welcome bigger engagement of information from establishment, but not information exactly as you said, not the standard way now. I've got so many examples of this from the communities we look at. That go to this website. Here's all the information you need about vaccine. That's not useful. Precisely, they're in a community talking about vaccines because they don't find that useful. So, bottom line is, from what we're trying to do is, it's like, first step is just look what's out there. That's what we're trying to do first. But then, once you know what's out there, you know that you can, and we can see it already. Anyone looking at our paper in Nature a couple of months ago can see immediately that going in and trying to target some of these, what we call red, the anti-vax, is hopeless. It's hopeless. And first of all, it's not right to do because they have their beliefs, but that's not the way to change this system. It's like, I'm going to get rid of bugs in my yard by looking at the ones that have 3 antlers or something. I mean, that's not the way to do it. We're trying to develop the understanding so that more effective kind of engagement can take place. So somebody should be engaging the anti-vax community about this story about the microchip. But unfortunately, all I see is, that debunked.
Right, exactly. That's what I see on every single article.
Yeah.
That's false.
That's misinformation. That's debunked. Right. And yet, it's not. As I said, it was actually, I can, to give out the reference, it was in the journal. It was published by a group, I think most of them were at MIT. It was funded by Gates Foundation. It was published in Science Translational Medicine on the 18th of December of 2019. And they know that. The anti-vaccination, I shouldn't even call them anti-vaccination because that's, they see themselves as choice. But they know that, and they feel offended, rightly so, when they're told that story is not true, because they know that's actually there. So
if you get recently, for instance, like with vaccine, Qantas Airlines says, you're going to be required to have a vaccine to fly.
Correct.
And the U.S. Ticketmaster says the same crap. So what do you expect people, like, they're being forced,
of course,
they're being labeled, of course they're going to react with hell no, they're not going to trust. And it also speaks to, like, why are there these tactics? Why is there this labeling and name calling and censoring and all the other stuff? If things were so good and so virtuous, you would think that this wouldn't be needed. It makes no sense.
Correct.
And I think that cognitive dissonance is the root. Even if you talk to these people and you tell them this, that, and the other, there's still like that disbelief has just been fostered by what's going on. It's like, do what I say and that's it. And we're going to label you and cast you out if you don't do what we say. Anyone would react completely, like, they'd fold their arms and they would close down to that.
Correct. And it's opening up the wider issue. When we were looking back at, how some of these people ended up in just the other field, extremism, etc. It's the same idea. Just telling people that is bad isn't, it can push them further. So I completely agree with you. The engagement is poor. And so you need to improve it. How do you improve it? You see what's out there. You see what they're talking about. You see what type of stories gain traction, but you don't squash it. You try and then see which piece of your network, which of the yards had that particular type of bug. And if I do a little bit of ecosystem understanding, maybe that bug can coexist with another one and not grow so big in terms of population. Blah, 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 blah. That's where we're ahead, because I do that kind of modeling. But it's very, very different than the kind of, there are bad guys, we're going to get you, and getting you because what you're doing is bad. It's just bad. And that, I completely agree with you. Just labeling it as bad, labeling them as wrong is itself wrong.
How is your physics background come into play here? Is it mathematical modeling or like what,
Yeah, I'm going to quickly put my math hat on here, because that we therefore have a system. Imagine the system now. The system contains three types of macro kind of collective object. One is the kind of community that supports vaccines, like a Gates Foundation. That's their Facebook page, say, for example. Another is a community of, say, mums or dads that are very concerned. They may have contact, they may have an autistic child or an ADHD, and they sort of deep down believe that they've never been the same since they had those vaccines. They are another community, and they may be on Facebook, but they may now have been chased off onto Gab. Maybe they're on Gab, they're on some of the other less regulated platforms. And then there's a third, which is this kind of, well, I'm actually a foodie. I've never thought about vaccines, but now I'm not sure. That's a third type of particle. So my math hat on, we used to dream of having more when you're doing theoretical physics, you're always kind of inventing more complicated models, even though you can't, unfortunately, pinpoint any empirical data. But here it's almost like the most complicated system I can think of. It's not just two, but three types of object. Think of three-sided football. Either US or European, but what would three-sided football look like? Imagine that there can be alliances, there can be everyone's fighting everyone else. One side is, it's absolutely complicated in terms of its dynamical behavior. So that's really what we then go in and try and look at what certain interventions might do mathematically.
Interesting. So I don't know how, it sounds like a massive undertaking. How far along are you in some of your modeling, and any surprising insights yet?
So one of the surprising insights is that we believe that you can manage, forget about the content for a while and think about the delivery. So we find with this three-sided, and you can almost, if anyone's with us on the analogy with three-sided football, of whatever version of football you want to think about, imagine there are kind of lulls in the game between two sides. What would the third side do? We find that, for example, that if instead of the messaging, instead of going kind of as soon as you see the opponents doing a lot of stuff, you go and do a lot of stuff. If you sit back and watch how the other two sides engage and then go in the quieter moments, there could be a lot of impact in that. So forgetting the actual messaging for a moment and thinking of the delivery. Nobody wants a pizza, even if it's the best pizza in the world, kind of wrapped up into a ball and thrown at the door. It's the delivery as much as the actual content that is important. And so we find in our types of modeling, which are kind of ecology based, but they're also from the physics angle, they're kind of the same physics equations as for lasers. They have these kind of surprising solutions that we are beginning to think, how could they be translated into a messaging?
Okay. I guess there's the famous three-body problem in physics. So
it is that.
The 3 billion body problem.
In fact, when I leave you now, I'm off to teach that three-body problem because I'm teaching the course on chaos and networks. And it's exactly that. I mean, it's hard enough to be a graduate course, and it's hard enough that I'm even trying to solve my own take-home final and not sure that I got it quite right. So, yeah, and that's what's the attractive part from a physicist's point of view.
Do you think there's going to be any analog of Heisenberg uncertainty?
That's a great question. That's a fantastic question. You might think that with the communities, the more you try to pin them down to a topic, the harder so it's almost like pinning down their position, the harder it will be to determine whether they're shifting, how quickly they're shifting, a kind of momentum. I haven't got there with that, but that's a great point. That's a great idea.
Yeah, and I wonder at what level a group is no longer a group.
Yeah.
Or how many people within a group, like what percentage of the group is required to advance idea and to change the focus of the group? Is it 10%? Is it, et cetera?
Well, I think, Richard, you're onto a good thing there. You better patent that idea, that theory, because I think that's a good idea. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah. Well, very good. I know that you're short on time. So what's the best way for people to find out more about your work?
So on my website, if you go to Google GW and Neil Johnson, they can see a list of papers there. And also, I mean, for better or for worse, our work has been, it seems to be talked about quite a bit now, again, for better or for worse. But it's interesting to follow some of those journalistic pieces, because you also get, I'm biased. I think the way we approach it is quote unquote a good way, but you can also then see competing views, people who think no, they don't go for the system view, look at individuals. So yeah, that's what I recommend.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Neil, thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.